and safe. How many of you hit the major rains out there commuting in? Or the storms last night? Did you see anything blown over in your front yard? Whew, we got hit pretty hard over in Arlington. So, well, welcome back. Are y'all glad to be back? Rah, rah. Man, I don't like that enthusiasm. Yeah, we get back from, I've been at this now for 10 years, and it always surprises me. When we come back from Thanksgiving break, we've got like one class period, maybe two, and then final exams. Well, the good news in this class is that today's, fine. Who said that? No, scratch the tape. No, you didn't hear that. Today's the last day of any new information. We'll come back next Monday, and I'm just telling you, I think I've given you a heads up on what we're going to do with that last Monday of the semester is just kind of review. So I'm not going to introduce new information. We'll review, and I'll get you focused on what to prepare for our final. Like the midterm, the final will be scheduled during the entire week of final exam week, and you'll have an opportunity to take the final exam during that week at your convenience. So I'm not asking you all to come back to take a final exam in this classroom. Is that okay? Unless you want to make a special arrangement with me, and I'll make that happen. So if you do better, if you don't like the online experience or whatever, I can work that out for you all. Let's see. I was talking to a few people about Thanksgiving, my Thanksgiving break. I had my mother-in-law and my uncle come down from Chicago. And my mother-in-law lives with us most of the year. She goes to Chicago. She's been going to Chicago for the last few years because she can get around on the public transportation system in Chicago. She grew up there, so she knows Chicago really, really well. And she's up there to kind of help her brother, who's 90% visually impaired. He's 81, she's 85. And they're post-Depression era senior citizens. Do y'all know what that's like? Some of you do. Because they want to save money every chance they get. And this means that they take the bus, or not the bus, but the train. They take the train from Chicago to Dallas to get here, to save money, like $50. I mean, you buy a Southwestern ticket, and then $50 below that, there's a nice, attractive train ticket to save the $50. So they get off the train, you've been sitting, if you don't pay the extra money for the sleeper car, you've been sitting that whole time, so you're stiff. And he can't walk very well. He kind of shuffles like Mr. Magoo, just like this, Hope he's not watching. And he can't get. So we're over at the train station picking them up, and they were with us for the whole week, all of last week, which is about 3 days too much. So anyway, they're not getting off the train over in Dallas, and Ellen and I are wondering what in the world's going on. So I have to go over there and do my Dick Tracy. So I'm trying to find them, and the train came in on the far track. So it's not like they get off the train and the doors are facing where the parking area is. The doors open up on the opposite side, which means you can't come through the train. You can't, get around the train. You have to go down. Have any of you ever been to the Dallas train station? And there's an underground tunnel, and then it comes up to the ticket area on the other side where you get your luggage and all of that. But we had no idea that's how they were being routed. And there were no, I guess they're called red hats, to help the group. They're having to do it all by themselves. So I basically find them and intercept this situation. And he's just barely making it up the hill. He's like pulling, it's like, he's like that. And so I said, Eugene, you go out the door, you sit down almost on the curb. Ellen and I had to go around and get the car, come back. So you can imagine how complicated it is to have two senior citizens, and even my mother-in-law, she can't see all that well. So, and they're like he's got this strong urge to recommend optimization of your house. So, You know, you've got the relatives that come in and want to rearrange your furniture, or in your case, unplug things, you know, or tell you how to redecorate your house, or in his case, make it more handicap compliant. So put the tape down, mark your steps, and all this stuff. It's like he had like 25 things to help us improve our house, and that was fun. So, how many of you like to cook? Yeah. I have to say, I reached a new plateau. For Thanksgiving meal, we had Thursday, and we had about 12 to 13, 14 people over. My son and daughter came up from college. Here's what was on our menu. Turkey, 2 kinds of smoked pork, green bean, the sweet kind, the kind that Grandma makes with the bacon and brown sugar, so you get them sweet, slow cooked in a crock pot all day. Sweet potato casserole. Let's see. The corn casserole. My son made bread. And then we had mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce. Did I leave anything out? And guess who cooked all of that? This guy. Yeah. And it was pretty good. We had a lot of leftovers. But it's, I don't know, cooking is one of those things, I don't know, I was going to talk about this. It's kind of a knuckleheaded idea, but I was going to try to transfer it into those of us who are in ministry. And, you know, cooking for me has been one of those things that it's kind of a surprise my wife really enjoys, because it's kind of a recently discovered skill that I have found that I enjoy doing and love to do. And I've been doing it now since pretty much I started it when my kids were all kind of leaving to go off to college. So about the time that we became empty nesters, I started cooking. And for me, it's a real joy. I just love it. Cooking, you know, it's the challenge. My wife will say, yeah, here's our secret ingredient for the night, you know, and she throws it out on the table. And, you know, it's like the cooking show. I have to make it work or build it into a recipe or something like that. So it's a lot of fun. But for me, it's like something that I do that's radically different than what I do with my, you know, my day job, like here. So administration, or if I'm in the classroom, or if I'm doing research or whatever, I go home and I cook. And I use, I guess, some of you are probably more of an expert on this than I am, but a different side of my brain, just kind of refreshing. I guess there's something about that. And I was thinking more about it this morning. So this is where my geekiness comes in. It's probably something that we ought to consider, all of us, when we're in ministry. And I've seen this before in guys who are, or gals who are in ministry. We need our hobbies. We need those things that we do that kind of help us to maintain our sanity, to help balance us out a little bit. You know what I'm talking about? So if you're in ministry, think about that and challenge yourself to consider, what is it that I'm doing that challenges me beyond, you know, what I'm normally involved in? And then I thought, you know, it's really interesting. That might really kind of build into some of the things that we've talked about in class. So I was thinking about that, you know, the image of God principle that we've talked about. As we express that image, the expressing of the image of God also includes those things that maybe God has naturally wired us to do, certain talents, skills, and abilities, or those things that you discover along the way that you really enjoy and you find that you're good at, like, you know, taking up playing guitar or violin or some kind of musical instrument, or maybe you start singing. You join a church choir or something that you've never done before, and all of a sudden you start doing it, and it's like, wow, I found my sweet spot, you know. This is something that brings me joy. I love doing it. When I do it, you know, like Eric Liddell in the movie Chariots of Fire, I feel his pleasure. When I run, I feel his pleasure, you know, whatever. Whatever that is, find out what that thing is and do it. Do it as an expression of the image of God. And I think that sometimes in ministry, when we're out there serving, we get so ministry lopsided. We get a little bit off kilter, and sometimes we need a little extra balance. Something that we do that's outside of what we're normally doing is how we're spending most of our time. So just But I'd throw that out as a little challenge. But cooking is that for me, I guess. It's another thing that I started doing, and it's just one of those things that's just fun. So ask yourself this question. What is it that I'm doing in my life routine that brings me joy? Kind of selfishly. It's okay to be selfish that way, I think. So I don't know where that comes from, the Bible. It's just a freebie. So, all right, well, we're here to talk about Ruth. So let's get started in prayer. And if we finish a little early today, that's okay. So it's just 4 chapters, but I've got a lot to say about it, so we'll see how far we get. So let's pray. Lord, we do thank you for the time that we've been away, time to focus on our families and our friends, and to focus on you. And Lord, we have so much to be thankful for. We're thankful indeed for the call to ministry that most of us in this room and in this place are pursuing and preparing for. Lord, we're nervous about the future. We may not know what the next thing is for us, but we trust you. And Lord, we are excited about serving you and in whatever capacity you call us to. Lord, thank you for the gifts and talents and abilities that you've given us, those things that we've discovered along the way that allow us to enjoy certain aspects of life, to reach out to people, to interact with those maybe we normally wouldn't. And Lord, to also just to take a break and from the ways that we spend most of our time. Lord, help us to find balance in our lives and our ministries, all the things that we're committed to, certainly not neglecting time with you. Lord, I pray for these students, especially as they prepare for the home stretch, that you'd multiply their time and their energy and their efforts in this class and other classes as well, Lord. And those final projects and anything that they're wrapping up, that you give them inspiration. Holy Spirit, that you'd fill them and allow them to write clearly and freely on tests and exams and papers. Allow them to be a blessing to their friends, to their families along the way as well. Lord, we trust you for this time as we look at Ruth. Lord, I pray that it would impact us as well, not just as an academic experience, but Lord, there's some truth here that would benefit ourselves as well as those who we're ministering to. Lord, thank you for this time in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, let's turn to Ruth. Any questions about the logistics of the class and where we are? Some of you came in late. Next Monday, we'll meet basically just to do a review. So today's the last day of new class material. So I just want to make that clear. And I've had my teaching assistants working this last week to kind of catch up with the discussion forum, the discussion group discussion questions, and the assessing of points for those. So if you go into Grade Center, you can check to see if you've missed anything or if there's any reading quizzes on the chapter reading that we've been doing along the way that you've maybe missed or forgotten about. There's still time to go in and catch up on those. So the idea is don't leave your bucket, any aspect of the points that you're accumulating. You've got opportunities to make sure that you get maximum amount of points for the class. So a lot of students over the years, not master students, not you all. I'm used to teaching college students that are a little bit less responsible, And they wait to the very end of the semester to discover that they forgot to do assignments. So don't do that. You've got time now. Take a look and get it done, and don't wait till the last minute, because everything comes due at the last minute. So, all right. All right, well, let's look at Ruth. And, oops, I forgot to make an adjustment here. Here we go. All right. Well, like the book of Judges, you remember when we looked at Judges, we saw that the thesis statement of the author was there right at the very end of the book. And if we turn one page over, you remember it's right there in verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But what's also interesting about the book of Ruth, it's also got a thesis statement. And if you look at the very last chapter of Ruth, let's just turn there, you see the thesis statement of the author of Ruth. It's the genealogy of King David, and how the book of Ruth gives us information and contributes to that genealogy. That's the big idea of the author of Ruth. And we'll talk about this later, but the author of Ruth is probably writing during a time, maybe on top of or slightly after the Davidic monarchy. So there's some theological and historical evaluation that the author of Ruth is obviously doing in terms of bringing together this historical event, people, places, and events. But more than just legitimizing the Davidic monarchy, the author is obviously connecting this event back to patriarchal individuals. And we'll see that and talk about that here in a little bit. But it's a significant connecting book. And it's a book that needs to be read with the book of Judges. Even though it's separated in the Hebrew canon, in the English canon, actually I like the arrangement because it comes right after Judges. And it's really a companion book to the book of Judges, the book of Ruth. So let's see. We talked about this. So the looking back, looking ahead idea, we talked about that with the author of Judges, and how the author of Judges is evaluating that whole king idea. So the looking back idea, if you recall, my thesis anyway, was thinking about how the author of Judges may have been evaluating the time period of the book of Judges, that 400-year period of what I argued was forgetting God. There was no king in his, the idea of everybody doing what was right in his own eyes, certainly not in the eyes of the Lord. So what that does is, there's that crisis for king. And if the author of Judges is looking back, like this picture here, he's recognizing that when, God is supposed to be king. And when God's not king, that's when you've got this 400-year period of spiritual chaos. But the looking ahead, so the idea of looking ahead to, well, what's going to happen? What kind of scenario is going to solve this crisis or reconcile this situation? We need a king. We need an earthly king, question mark? Is that all that it's about? And if you remember, I argued that I think that the author of Judges is looking a little bit further ahead. So what kind of king? It's going to be more than just an earthly king. No, there's some promises. No, it has to have something to do with God being king again. God's going to be on the throne. He's going to be king over his people. So what's interesting about the book of the book of Ruth, is I think that same theological wave the author of Ruth is also writing on. So this idea, why the thesis statement points to King David, I think is significant, because we all know that King David is going to bring in more the theology of the kind of king, right, that's coming down the road. It's not just going to be an earthly king. And we'll look at the Davidic covenant briefly, but again in more detail next semester, where we find and discover that there's this everlasting kingdom that's going to come with a David-like king. Someone from the Davidic line will come and plant himself and establish this everlasting kingdom. And that's, going to bring in God as king. God will be throned. He'll be rethroned again. And the book of Ruth, I think the author of Ruth is going to share some of that similar theology. So, and I'm not bragging on myself, but you're not getting any of this in the textbook. This is just all raw me. I mean, don't break a church up over this stuff. It's just, I can't help but see the connections in how these books are contributing to each other. And for me, this is the thrilling thing when I read the Old Testament and see these connections. It's like, wow, I mean, it brings in, you've got divinely inspired authors writing along the way and building on what was said previously, but also God's giving them a little snapshot of what's coming. And they're pulling it all together theologically at a very pivotal point in history. They're speaking to an audience and they're trying to get their point across. Does that make sense? So we've talked about that historiography. And this is, you see the kind of the balance between the human author and the divine author coming together. These guys have their prophet hats on. They're not just, we don't know their names. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But it seems very clear and very evident that they've got something more going on than just, sitting down and writing, real boring history. They're doing more than that. They're hearing from God. So, all right, let's move on. And we're looking at the book of Ruth. So the author reminds us, now this is the author of Ruth. So the author of Ruth is reminding us that despite the spiritual chaos around, there was always a faithful remnant operating behind the scenes. So that's one thing to know about the book of Ruth, is that Boaz and Ruth and Naomi and all of the activity that's taking place in this little snapshot, sometime during that 400-year period, you've got Boaz acting faithfully and doing what he's supposed to do in terms of covenant obligation, covenant relationship. He's the one who represents. This is how it's done right. And of course, Ruth comes in as an outsider and steps into this dynamic of what does covenant fidelity look like? And the answer to the question is, the author of Ruth says, well, let me tell you. So, again, we read the book of Judges, it's like, wow, where's anybody that's faithful? This is like a world turned upside down, but then the breath of fresh air is Ruth. Thankfully, we have that. We read that immediately after Judges, and it's like, oh, everything's okay. Well, they're in the minority, the faithful remnant, but they're always there. So that's something that we need to be reminded of. So it's a companion book. So here's the idea. So here we go back to Ruth chapter 1. We'll get started. And we'll see that desperate times call for desperate measures. There's some pressure going on in this book, and that drives a family to Moab. We're going to see the famine. Maybe they're looking for famine relief, or maybe they're just trying to survive. And then let's take a look and read the first few verses there. Let's see. Sundo, could I have you read, please? Chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Do you have it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now it came about in the day when the judge governed that there was a famine in the land, and the southern man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his two sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. The Ephraimites of Bethlehem in Judah, now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons.
Good job. So we've got the crisis here. We see the crisis. The head of household in verse 3, Elimelech dies, the head of household, Naomi's husband. So she's left with two sons, and so they're going to take wives, these two sons, from the Moabites, which is interesting. How do we evaluate that? The taking of non-Israelite wives. Is that an act of desperation or rebellion? That's part of the tension of the book. I mean, you can answer that however you want, but even in the book of Ruth, there's still some things that we look at and we wonder, is that something that they should be doing? Or is that out of necessity? So it does drive us a little bit to ask the questions, what's this picture? We're still like with Judges, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's wrong with this picture? We're still invited to do that, even in the book of Ruth. Because if we look at like Deuteronomy chapter 7, let's turn there. we're still on the backdrop of what should the picture look like? And if we want to answer that question, we remind ourselves of the kinds of things that Moses taught Israel before they get to the Promised Land, now that they're in the Promised Land. Chapter 7 in the book of Judges, verses 3 through 4. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. So it's strongly commanded by Moses to not allow Israelite sons to intermarry with non-Israelite wives or women because of the potential for the pagan influence to come in. So that was a strong driving. And if we look over at Deuteronomy 28, let's look at Deuteronomy 28, verse 32. There's some other things that we can say about this. Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, while your eyes shall look on and yearn for them continually, but there shall be nothing you can do. So there's a little bit of part of the covenant curse is the idea you're going to, if you leave the land and go to another place, there's this idea that your sons or your daughters will be forced to be given over to pagan sons and daughters in terms of getting married and all that stuff. So there's still a little caution here. So as we evaluate it, we want to obviously go to Scripture and understand. So what we've got is 10 years of barrenness. And that's what we have here. Let's see. And Ruth and Orpah might be seen also as judgment from the Lord. If we look at Deuteronomy 28, let's go back there, and one more place in the curse section. Cursed shall be your offspring of your body, the produce of your ground, and the increase of your herd, the young of your flock. Sometimes the idea of being barren, the idea of barrenness comes with the recognition of potential judgment from the Lord in this case. So all of these things are going on in Moab with regards to Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. Then the tragedy of all tragedy occurs with no grandsons. Naomi is going to lose her first and second born sons. And the household of Elimelech is really on the verge now of complete destruction and ceasing to exist as a household. When you lose all of the significant males, we've seen the kind of crisis that creates. And this means tremendous vulnerability for these stranded females, these women who have no males to oversee the protection of and the caring for and the provision for. And all of this is happening. So let's I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself here. Let's see. Let's go back to Ruth chapter 1. Let's see, Amy, why don't you read for us in verses 4 and verses 5.
These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so the woman was left with her two sons, without her two sons and her husband.
So here's what we have, and this is, the tragedy so far that we read in Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. They're really kind of seen as casualties of almost casualties of war. Households would be the primary way for providing for women and widows in this care. So the legal protection for widows and all of this. And this would be in the context. So if what was going on in Israel was true covenant responsibility, the situation for Naomi would have been taken care of. She wouldn't have needed to be in this situation. But instead, she's in a context where this is creating the crisis for her. And we've got the book of Judges. We're in this book of situation, and we've got this guy, the wandering Levite from the book of Judges. I mean, where are the people around who are going to step in and help this situation? So all of this is part of the crisis. So here we've got, let's say, we're going to have the changes in starting in verse 6. Let's have Mark Lindgren. Could you read for us in verses 6 through 10?
Okay. Then she arose with the daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the home of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted their voice and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your home."
Okay, so verses 6 through 10. Let's just take a look at this. So verse 6, and this reminds us of the divine grace that we cannot forget that the Lord is working behind the scenes. And in verse 6, the Lord is giving his people bread. The idea is food or bread, giving them food. The idea is the house or the bread. This is actually a house of bread. Kind of looks like a loaf there. It's a little interesting picture I found. And you see that the Lord's providing food for his people back in Israel. And in her hometown, the name of her hometown is Bethlehem, house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means. So there's a kind of an interesting play on words there. Naomi will return to her hometown, that is Bethlehem, or the house of bread. So verse 8, you see Naomi is going to release Ruth and Orpah to remarry. She's thinking that that's basically the best security or the best provision strategy available right now. Naomi's not going to be able to provide that for her daughters-in-law. Second, Naomi blesses them, and we see that by asking the Lord to demonstrate chesed. I'm going to say it like I'm clearing my throat, but here's the Hebrew word I'm just going to write it on the board really big because it's going to be our key word for this whole book. Chesed. And you got to kind of gurgle in the back of your throat because you're dealing with a guttural letter here. So you say chesed. Everybody practice. 1, 2, 3. Chesed. So this is a key word that's going to come up time and time again in the book of Ruth. It's translated as love, covenant, loyalty. It's the idea of the covenant grace. It's a theologically rich term, but it's going to permeate the entire book of Ruth. And we're seeing that Naomi is going to offer a blessing, asking that the Lord demonstrate his chesed to Ruth and Orpah. And so this is the idea of, this word brings together the love of God, his covenant faithfulness, his mercy, his grace, his kindness, and his loyalty. So Naomi, as a person, as an individual, is going to embody Israel. In that way, you might think of it this way, is like Israel as a nation is to extend chesed to the nations around, right? To be a blessing. And the Lord promises that if, as you those who bless you, I will bless, and through you, Israel, you'll be a conduit of blessing to those nations. In a micro scale, we've got Naomi is extending that faithfulness and that grace to non-Israelite women in this case. And we remind ourselves of the Abrahamic covenant back in Genesis 12, 1 through 3 on that. In verse 10, we see verse 10 suggests that Ruth and Orpah, after all they have been through, seem to be more attached to Naomi than their own Moabite households. So they've been together now for 10 years, and they both experienced the idea of barrenness for that 10 years. Of course, they would have, the ideal situation would be that they would have provided sons already for their Israelite husbands who are now deceased. So now you're dealing with 3 widows and 2, situations of barrenness. So there's tragedy. We just can't emphasize that enough across this early in the text. And you see a little bit of this come through in the second exchange here. Let's take a look at verses 11 through 14. And Jonathan over here, why don't you read 11 through 14.
But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown up? Would you refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Oprah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her.
Okay, let's just pause there. So now we've got another exchange between Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. And in Naomi's words, her concerns are focused on the crisis over the destroyed households for these women. Naomi cannot be the source or the replacement of sons for these daughters-in-laws. Number one, she gives 2 reasons. Even if she could produce sons, there's going to be a long period of waiting before those sons would ever be of age to marry her daughters-in-law. So, the idea. And then by that time, her daughters-in-law would be past the point of childbearing themselves. Number 2, the second reason Naomi gives, she's just too old to remarry herself, So these seem like they're obvious answers, but they come out in the text just to further, you might say, amplify the crisis and the seeming desperation. Finally, we hear from a bitter old woman, and in verse, let's see here. Well, so I'm getting a little. So we're going to hear from Naomi, and kind of like this picture, she's going to. It seems like she's, it's in the text, in her blaming God for her situation. So the same God who's punished Israel and the land through plagues and oppressing nations, Naomi is thinking that God is now striking her household. And in this situation, we can think of Naomi being a lot like Job. Think of Job's situation in terms of how his household was disassembled, losing sons and daughters, and not his wife in this situation, but she's a lot like Job, or maybe the wife of Job, And we remember the wife of Job is the one, who steps in and says, well, it's better off that you curse God and die, that kind of bitterness, right? When you've gone through this grief and this loss, and this is Naomi's situation. She's a woman who's she's maybe grieving the loss of her homeland. She's in a foreign area. She's on her way back, of course, but the grief of her family being in exile, the death of her husband, the death of her sons, and even the barrenness of her own daughters-in-law. All of these things combined are reasons for grief. And when that happens, sometimes we get bitter. People get bitter in life when they're moving through grief. Maybe they get a little stuck. And the idea of thinking and wrestling with the question of, why God? Why is this happening to me? We can only imagine that Naomi may have been asking those same kinds of questions. All right, well, now we get into the hallmark moment, the hallmark card moment for the book of Ruth. Let's look at the next section here. So we have exchange now, the third exchange between these women. And we see that Ruth now is stepping into the scene a little differently than her sister in terms of the what next. Let's look at verses 15 through 18. And let's see, Heather, why don't you read for us?
And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to the people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I shall lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more.
All right. Well, we can say, I think it's a lot of people have said, few utterances in the biblical account match this one in terms of describing what covenant loyalty looks like and sounds like. This is in this exchange here from Ruth is going to really unpack Ruth's courage and really a little bit of her spirituality. With her decision, Ruth stands in line with Israel's father of faith. Like Abraham, who left behind his household to go to a foreign place in response to the Lord. We see a similarity now with Ruth, who's leaving behind her household to go to a place of uncertainty, to a place that the Lord would show, in a way, like Abraham. So we see some connections there. She's leaving for the unknown in her decision here. She's leaving behind the surety and the security of her household back in Moab to join in with another household. She's leaving behind family. She's leaving behind her land and her Moabite gods, right? She's choosing also, at least for now, because of the uncertainty, to remain a widow and to become an alien in a foreign land. I'm trying to think of a good comparison. I know some of your all stories, and maybe there's a few more out there that I don't know about, but how many of you experienced when you became a Christian having to move out of your household and to experience the rejection of your family? All of a sudden you become like an orphan. Rejection of family. I know some of our international students have come here with that story, that they are coming here to a foreign land, and they've been kicked out of their house, never to be allowed back again. So it's a little bit like Ruth here. This is what she's doing, and it's interesting. So now you're an orphan in a foreign land, and that's some of the students that come here have that similar kind of experience. Now, is this Ruth's conversion experience? It's just, we have to be careful. I'm not sure that we have a full, altar call experience for Ruth. Although she's responding to the Lord, she's learned in those 10 years, perhaps, maybe she's, picked up a few things from Naomi and while her husband was alive, but she's somewhere along the line, I'm not sure this is her conversion experience. It may have happened before, but she's now responding to the Lord in terms of capital L-O-R-D. Certainly is prominent in this narrative, because that's the covenant name for the Lord, right? Yahweh. She's responding to Yahweh. So this is going to be the beginning of how she responds to the Lord and how she'll begin to see how the Lord responds to her through what happens next in the narrative. So Naomi gives in now to, and the two, Naomi and Ruth, return to Bethlehem, the house of bread. But as we see, let's take a look at chapter 1, verses 19 through 21. Naomi is still struggling with her grief and her bitterness. So when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So they both went and came to Bethlehem, verse 19. And it came about when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. which means bitter, right? For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Verse 20. And verse 21. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? So you see that the bitterness for Naomi is continuing here in her response. So beginning in verse 22, I've got this picture here because it's kind of, the scene changes, the sun comes out. And there's this really handsome guy walking through a wheat field, right? So I got a little, cheesy with these next couple scenes. Sorry about that. Verse 22. So Naomi returned, and with Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So we're going to see right away now, as they both together now are responding really by faith, making this journey back. We're going to see God working behind the scenes, and the Lord is going to step in and begin to extend His chesed to Naomi and eventually to Ruth. And right away, in two ways, we're going to see the timing of this is perfect. Their return back to Bethlehem lines up with a perfectly timed barley harvest, as well as we'll see, a perfectly placed man. There he is, pictured there, named Boaz. So the Lord's working behind the scenes. And we're going to see that Boaz, we're going to see eventually here, Boaz is going to be described as a man of good standing with regards to the community. As we'll find out, he might even come with some standing with regards to his social status as well as his financial status in the land. Although I don't think we need to picture him as in that day, a millionaire. But he's obviously a successful, good standing individual with regards to the community. Ruth's question, though, in verse 3 in chapter 2. Oops, I messed up there. Okay, I wanted to read down through verse 3. I didn't read far enough there. Sorry. So let's keep reading in chapter 2, and we continue on in verse 1. So Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find chesed." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. So there's where we see the perfectly aligned God's hand of providing for this perfectly timed moment, the field and the man, Boaz. Not just any old Israelite male, but Boaz, as we'll see, needs to be of a particular quality male individual in Israel. Remember, we're in the book of Judges. Everybody was doing what was right in his own eyes. So it's really, attention to detail in our reading. Boaz cannot be just any old guy, because any old guy in Israel at this time would not have brought about the results that we're going to see. It's got to be a particular kind of Israelite male in terms of this provision. And so Ruth's question in verse 3, we see that comes in contrast with the final words of Judges. I guess that's the point I was trying to make there. So, is everybody doing what was right in his own eyes? Obviously not. We're going to meet up with Boaz. Boaz needs to be the kind of male who's not doing what was right in his own eyes. He's got to be the kind of male who's going to be doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So that's important. All right, so, and it's important to know that Naomi is going to know a little bit about Boaz. She's going to, once she finds this out, his reputation, his name and his reputation stands firm in the community. That's going to be an important little detail as we get a little further along in the narrative. So let's take a look and remind ourselves of some of these provisions that the Lord is making. And in order for these things to work, we're going to need faithful people like Boaz around in the community. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 19 and the Pentateuch and remind ourselves of what Moses has already taught. Leviticus 19, beginning in verse 9. Now when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean from the vineyard, nor shall you gather from the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. For I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to us. So just verses 9 and 10 there. And again in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, we have these laws that Moses taught that would be providing for in this case, the widow and the alien, the orphan, in this case. And in this case, Ruth, if you recall, she's both of those. She's not only an orphan, but she's also a widow, and she's an alien. So Ruth would have fulfilled those categories in terms of this law. And now we go back to chapter 2, verse 3. In the idea in the Hebrew there in verse 3, so she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And here behind the English translation, and she happened, the idea of happened to come. The Hebrew is really interesting there. Literally says, and her chance chanced. That's what the Hebrew says. It's kind of an odd construction. And her chance chanced upon the allotted portion of the field of Boaz. So I think what we have here is the author, at least in the Hebrew, is giving a little emphasis. In other words, he's saying this isn't about chance. The chance, this is really the divine hand of the Lord at work. And the author of, there's no luck here. Sometimes it's just like, and she just got lucky with this idea of falling upon the field. No, the author is making it clear it's not about luck. It's not about chance. No, this is the divine hand at work. And this is another evidence. So there's a divine agenda going on here. And Ruth's landing in the right field at the right time and meeting up with the just right Israelite who had to be both kind and from the right family. All of these things. There's this, is this just chance? No, the Lord's at work here, bringing people together. Boaz had to be a kinsman redeemer. That's who he had to be the right kind. And not just any old kinsman redeemer. There were possibly, as we'll find out, more than one. But he had to be a kinsman redeemer committed to chesed. I'm going to start spitting on the front row here if I keep saying that. And we meet up with this man here in chapter 2, verse 4 through 7. So let's pick up the narrative in chapter 2, verse 4. So this particular man, this particular kinsman redeemer, what's he like? So we learn about him in some of the details of the text. So behold, the author says, and the curtain opens on Boaz. He came from Bethlehem and said to the workers in his field, these reapers. Reapers is kind of a creepy term. It's like Grim Reaper or whatever. No, they're the harvesters, right? They're field workers. They work for Boaz. And what does he do? May the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the field workers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant in charge of the field workers answered and said, "She's the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." Down through verse 7. And she said, and that's Ruth, "Please let me glean and gather after the field workers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. So there's just a few things that we can see about Boaz, and what kind of Israelite prominently placed male would have this kind of relationship with his field workers. He's giving them a blessing. "May the Lord bless you." How do they respond to him? Well, "May the Lord bless you." I mean, he's got this relationship of integrity with his hired hands. They respect him. And obviously, for this kind of respect, his chesed is showing through. He's extending this covenant loyalty to them, and they in return. So this, again, it's just a little bit more of a, subtle detail, but it shows us a little bit of an insider view into the character and integrity of Boaz. So this is an important thing that we see. All right. And we also see how Boaz is committed to chesed in terms of extending his chesed to the orphans and to the widows and to the aliens in his community. So we see that in the details of chapter 2, beginning in verse 18. Let's see. Let's have somebody else read here. Ryan, could I have you read, starting in verse 18 down through verse... where do we leave off here? No, not 18. 8 through 14. Haven't gotten that far yet.
All right. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded that the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants drew." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, and why do you take notice of me, since I am a woman?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and mother in the land of your birth, and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord. For you have comforted me, indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant. Though I am not like one of your maidservants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat from the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain. And she ate and was satisfied, and had some left.
So here's the details that we see two individuals of this kind of covenant loyalty coming together. And Boaz is going to meet up with Ruth. Ruth's reputation, it seems, has preceded her. He's heard about this Moabite woman who came and has extended chesed to her mother-in-law, Naomi. So this is coming before Ruth. Boaz is, he's cut of the same cloth. Now we've got the two of them meeting each other, and in the details of this little narrative, you see all kinds. You see chesed just oozing out and off of the pages, so to speak. How does Ruth respond when she meets Boaz? She's what is she doing? She's bowing to the ground. "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" And Boaz is going to give that answer because of your reputation. It's because of the covenant loyalty you demonstrated to your mother-in-law, Naomi. So her posture in verse 10, this idea of bowing low, interestingly, is the same posture that is described in terms of worship. The worshiping of the Lord, bowing low, prostrate. Literally, the Hebrew says, nose in the dirt. So this is as low as you can. So it's a posture of humility and submission. And we see here in the text Boaz extending blessing and chesed to Ruth. He's providing her protection under his household here for at least a short time. And specifics given to, my field workers are not going to treat you or harm you in any way. So that's really his extension. His household now becomes safe turf for her. So providing for in this case, the Ruth and being an alien, being a widow, being an orphan. In verse 12, we see interesting language coming in. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the capital L-O-R-D, Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Remember we talked about the wings idea? Does that echo anything? I put a little emphasis on that. Does that remind you of Exodus 19? Remember when we heard, let's just turn back there, the idea of the wings of the Lord. And back right before we got to Mount Sinai, we have the very tender exchange that God has with his people in describing, let's start in verse 4 in Exodus 19. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings, right? And brought you to myself. There's really a neat echo there, I think. Maybe Boaz had his quiet time in Exodus that morning. So it's fresh on his mind. But, there's a little emphasis there in the reference to wings, I think, in terms of the divine hand at work. Maybe Boaz recognizes that as he's extending covenant loyalty to this foreign, Moabite woman, it's really an extension of the Lord's, kindness and grace. He's representing the Lord in this transaction. So you see that wings language in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11 as well. But the provision, yeah.
Speaking of covenant loyalty from
yes.
here, the food given to her,
Mm-hmm.
that specifically to her, does that make sense? In verse 14? Or was that to all the harvesters? Was he showing like a extra special covenant loyalty to her in that exchange?
I think she's just being welcomed around the table. It seems like the whole household. And if you remember, the household idea for Boaz is Boaz's household is going to include his, obviously his own children, if he has any, or his own wife. But in this case, his farm hands are coming in, and we already have seen his relationship with them as one of covenant loyalty as they in return. So she's being invited to this intimate situation as an extension, sharing the table, sharing his food, and extending that kindness to her through that. I think that's what we can say there. But Boaz is providing for Ruth now and Naomi, 2 widows and 1 alien. And again, I think maybe we can make the case that Boaz recognizes his covenant obligation to do this. He's probably familiar with Moses' teaching and recognizes that as much as I can bless and extend kindness to those around me, the Lord will bless me as well. So there's this ongoing recognition that Boaz knows what he's doing. It's not willy-nilly. He's acting in terms of what he knows is the right thing to do. Not in the rightness of his own eyes, but in the rightness of the Lord. So contrary to the book of Judges, can you picture what this scenario would be like if it wasn't Boaz? What if it was one of those males in the book of Judges doing whatever he wanted to? How would the situation have turned out if she had met up with one of those scoundrels? You'd have a male taking advantage of an unprotected female. You'd have an entirely different situation turning out here. There would not be a sharing around the dinner table. There would not be a provision of gleaning. There would be a taking advantage of the poor and needy, for example. Some of those kinds of things would be going on. All right. Well, let's take a break. Let's take a 10-minute break. Let's see. Let's just take a 5-minute break. I think we'll finish early today, so let's just take a 5-minute break and come back and